What if the greatest threat to humanity arrived as a gift? A dying alien empire has opened its gates, offering us a world overflowing with technology, resources, and wonder. But behind the golden invitation lies a desperate secret. We were never guests. We were chosen as replacements to revive a species collapsing from within. Now, Earth's envoys are vanishing. The gifts are becoming prisons, and our DNA is their last hope. Join us as we explore a story of survival, deception, and a question that hits close to home. What would you do if saving yourself meant dooming another species? Section 1. The invitation from Glassreach. It arrived not with urgency, but with elegance. A transmission laced in harmonic compression, folded within a shell of quantum resonance so intricate that Earth's decryption arrays paused to verify it wasn't a synthetic hallucination. The signal came from a system marked as uninhabitable just 3 years prior, its sun classified as unstable and its planetary surface uncharted. Yet here it was, beaming through the void with precision and clarity, bearing neither demands nor warnings, but an invitation, cordial, ornate, and laced with data so rich that every frame of the message contained new linguistic structures, biosignatures, and refined environmental spectra that spoke of impossible biodiversity. For 3 days, Earth Command's Stellar Diplomatic Bureau analyzed the packet in sterile clean rooms and deep isolation labs, while cultural engineers and exolinguists unraveled the language of a civilization that referred to itself simply as the Aelari. Their words shimmered with layered meaning, each syllable a chord, each phrase a chord progression, as if the entire species communicated through syntax and symphony, but beneath the artistry was a clarity of intent. They were dying, and they were offering humanity something no species had ever dared share without war or conquest: a home. The Aelari invitation was stunning in both scale and serenity. Their world, Glassreach, lay across the Canthus Fold, 5 transit jumps from Earth, surrounded by a debris field that, from orbit, resembled a halo of crushed crystal. The message offered unfettered access to the planet's oceans, forests, and atmospheric reserves, along with unrestricted rights to explore its archives, technologies, and biological repositories. It included guided flight paths for approach, pre-mapped biosafety corridors, and even aesthetic guidelines for diplomatic attire, woven through cultural context layers that read less like rules and more like artful requests. In the council chambers beneath Pacific Command arcology, where the curved walls shimmered with augmented threat maps and long-wave diplomatic archives, there was no consensus, only awe and suspicion in equal measure. Some argued it was a trap, a honeypot engineered with irresistible beauty and false vulnerability. Others believed it might be the galaxy's first genuine gesture of peace, a dying empire's last hope to cede its wisdom before fading entirely. But what no one could ignore was the weight of the opportunity. Glassreach was rich beyond estimation, its biology seemingly untouched by industrial scarring, its atmospheric balance ideal for human habitation, and its orbit in perfect resonance with the system's gravity wells. In the end, the vote was unanimous, not because everyone trusted the Aelari, but because none of them could bear the possibility of declining the greatest offer ever extended to the species. And so, the Artemis Halcyon was dispatched, Earth's finest diplomatic vessel, retrofitted with linguistic holocores, biosample vaults, and quantum relay uplinks designed to preserve every word, every sound, every gesture of first contact. Aboard her, Captain Emil Durek reviewed the final checklist with a kind of reverence more common to pre-launch rituals of a bygone era. His crew had trained not for war, but for understanding. Xenoanthropologists, planetary ethicists, neural translators, and a single biogeneticist with clearance levels so high that even her field logs were sealed in layered encryption. Dr. Marin Ives had no illusions about the beauty of what they were flying into. She had studied extinction for most of her life, and she knew one truth that few acknowledged. Dying empires don't always fall. Sometimes they reach. As the Halcyon passed beyond Earth's orbital plane, slipping into folded transit with a tremor of gravitic displacement, the transmission from Glassreach continued to play on loop within the ship's central archive. Its tones, haunting and patient, whispered promises through harmonics that echoed like a lullaby across vacuum silence. It wasn't asking for help. It was offering a gift, and no one aboard had yet dared ask what it would cost. Please do press that like button if you have enjoyed this story so far. That would mean a lot to me. Now back to the story. Section 2. Envoys Among Ruins. The descent to Glassreach was choreographed by planetary orbital matrices that guided the Artemis Halcyon with a precision no one expected from a civilization claiming terminal decline. And as the vessel coasted into the upper layers of the atmosphere, the crew was struck not by desolation, but by overwhelming beauty, an entire planet wrapped in living architecture, woven landscapes, and bioluminescent patterns that pulsed in harmony with oceanic tides far below. The clouds parted to reveal towers of glass and resin rising from carved cliff faces, their surfaces refracting sunlight in shifting hues like oil on water, while bridgeways of living plant matter stretched between mesas that swayed ever so slightly with wind currents engineered for balance and breathability. And yet, beneath the artistry, something felt wrong. Too still, too quiet, too perfect for a planet supposedly emptying of life. Landing protocols engaged automatically, pulling the ship into a hoverlock above a spiraling structure that resembled both a cathedral and a coral bloom, its platforms unfolding from within the rock like petals greeting an overdue sun. A delegation of Aelari awaited them, though delegation barely captured the spectacle. Each figure shimmered with translucent robes of biomechanical weave, their limbs elongated and jointless, their skin a pearlescent sheen that shifted with the angle of the light, as if their very existence required constant retranslation by the eye. Their leader introduced herself not with name, but with memory, a brief sensory stream injected through the ship's ambient translation field, showing a river of light cascading down obsidian cliffs, a child's breath caught in joy, and a moment of silence during a rainstorm that had not fallen in decades. Her voice followed like a melody placed after the thought. We welcome you, children of continuity. You arrive as heirs to all that will remain. No weapons were detected, no defenses raised. The Aelari offered the humans water drawn from planetary veins, food crafted from bioconversion processes so advanced it mimicked the texture and nutritional composition of Earth's own agriculture. The crew moved through ceremonial pavilions where holograms replayed the rise and collapse of Aelari civilizations. Their golden age shone in spiraling chronologies woven into living walls, their decline mourned through harmonized light displays that triggered visceral emotional response even without translation. Yet for all the honor and pageantry, there was an absence no one could ignore. The cities were vast, the archives unsealed, the technology still functioning at levels Earth's brightest minds would require centuries to master, but there were no children, no younglings, no signs of new life. Every Aelari encountered was old, ancient by some biological estimation, sustained not through vitality, but through preservation systems embedded into their own bodies like exoskeletal life support. Dr. Marin, I've noticed first. The gene-encoded warmth typical of reproductive cycles in complex biospecies was entirely absent. The Aelari were sterile, not just temporarily impaired or genetically diminished, but systematically and absolutely incapable of renewal. Their genome had collapsed inward, refined for intelligence and harmony until it reached a point of irreversible narrowing, an evolutionary cul-de-sac from which no mutation could escape. The gift, it seemed, was not the planet. It was inheritance. In private, Captain Durek convened the senior officers and specialists, locking the comms against even passive Aelari listeners. "They're not offering us resources," he said, his voice taut with realization. "They're offering us themselves. This isn't a gesture. It's a recruitment." Marin laid out the data in silence. Embedded within the food samples, the structural interfaces, and even the air filtration membranes were traces of integrated human-compatible protein scaffolds. Not invasive, not aggressive, but suggestive of an underlying biological integration effort already underway. The planet wasn't just ready for humanity's arrival. It had prepared for it. The question now was no longer whether the Aelari could be trusted. The question was how long humanity had before the invitation became a necessity, and whether it was already too late to leave. If you have enjoyed this story so far, then please do subscribe and hit the bell icon to listen to more stories like this one. Let's get back to the story now. Section 3. Cradle in the Marble Sky. The orbital habitat they were invited to next, designated Marisvan in the Aelari tongue, shimmered like a pearl hung against the darkness. A biosynthetic ring station that drifted in geosynchronous balance between two gravitational nodes, neither tethered to planet nor moon, but pulsing with atmospheric stabilizers that maintained an artificial pocket of breathable air and steady photonic diffusion across its interior gardens. It had been built during what the Aelari called their last bloom, a desperate burst of innovation meant to preserve the species through spatial and genetic redundancy. Yet what remained inside was not a cradle of hope. It was a gallery of extinction. Sarah Naidu, humanity's appointed envoy, stepped through the translucent docking corridor with a heavy sense of unreality, her boots making no sound on the memory-reactive surface beneath her. The entire structure was made not of metal or polymer, but of woven carbon lattices infused with sensory feedback, walls that responded to emotion, halls that bent to intention, and ceilings that displayed not stars, but simulations of extinct sky cycles from dozens of once thriving biomes. They were met not by hosts, but by projections, Aelari elders long since passed, speaking in harmonized echoes recorded across centuries, their voices braided with tones that triggered sympathetic responses in human neural pathways. These were not messages meant to convince. They were confessions, regrets, apologies for beauty weaponized into sterility, warnings etched into resonance. At the heart of the ring station lay a vast arboretum sealed behind living glass. Inside, the last remaining samples of Aelari reproductive genomes were suspended in fractal crystal matrices, perfectly preserved, utterly inert. Every attempt to restart the cycle had failed. Adaptive nanosplicing, retroviral cascade induction, even quantum-assisted gamete simulation, all had only accelerated degradation. The Aelari had engineered themselves into permanence, and in doing so, had edited out the very capacity to begin again. We desired no death, one recording intoned, as Sarah and Dr. Marin eyes passed beneath a canopy of light-woven flowers that bloomed only in response to proximity. We sought to refine ourselves into understanding, but understanding has no children, only memory. In the central chamber, a gift was presented, a genome key encoded in gold-stabilized protein chains, modeled upon what the Aelari had come to call the ecliptic strain. It was in effect a request not to save the Aelari, but to join them, to offer human genomic material into the Aelari seed line and allow a new synthesis, one that would bind the two species together forever in ways no diplomacy or alliance could ever hope to match. Marin's analysis was immediate and precise. They've reverse-engineered enough of our biology to mimic compatibility, but without active human reproductive cells, they can't replicate. They need full donors, voluntary, unmodified, fertile. She paused, then added with a scientist's clinical horror, they've sequenced our immune variants, our mitochondrial thresholds. They know what traits they want. This isn't rescue. It's curation. Captain Durek clenched his fists, the shadows across his features deepening under the Arboretum's gentle light. "And if we refuse?" he asked. The answer came not in words, but in silence. A silence amplified by the vast emptiness around them. No other species responded to the Aelari call. No other voices echoed through the invitation channels. No other envoys had ever been seen again. This was not a question of ethics anymore. It was a countdown. Back aboard the Artemis Halcyon, a scan of the planet's surface revealed disturbing alterations in the biosphere. Minute shifts in soil chemistry and microbial ratios that had begun during the humans' arrival window. The air was slowly being tuned for dual-species compatibility, not forcefully, not overtly, but inevitably. The Aelari were not waiting for an answer. They had already begun preparing the nursery. Section 4. Beneath the bloom line. It began with a tremor, not a seismic shift, but a molecular one, beneath the engineered soil of the Invitation Gardens, where the roots of golden leaf plants, once thought decorative, revealed themselves to be bioactive sensors tuned to human pheromonal presence. Sarah Naidu crouched near one such vine, brushing aside a layer of nutrient moss, her gloves pricking with static as the fibers recoiled slightly before reshaping themselves to display an internal structure of lattice-bound protein chains woven with human-compatible base sequences. It wasn't just flora. It was a living database, a tissue archive, designed to absorb and replicate biological signals through slow transference. "Someone needs to explain why these plants recognize us," she said quietly, her voice low over the shared comms. "They're not learning. They already know." Dr. Marin Ives, monitoring the fluctuations from the Artemis Halcyon's gene lab, confirmed the unspoken suspicion. The plants weren't scanning. They were syncing. Somehow, without direct sampling, they had already adapted to human biological profiles. When cross-referenced against crew health telemetry, slight protein leakage was found in every subject exposed to the atmosphere. Harmless on paper, but directionally targeted. The Aelari Gardens were absorbing humanity bit by bit without breaking the surface. Beneath the surface level of the Arboretum, an access point was found, masked as a horticultural nutrient processor, but in fact leading to a substructure not listed in any diplomatic registry. The passage descended through a spiral of silkstone steps into what could only be described as a vault. The temperature dropped sharply, and the lighting shifted from organic daylight hues to a cool indigo spectrum, revealing crystalline walls etched with radial patterns that pulsed faintly as the human delegation entered. Each pulse matched their heartbeats. There were no guards, no videos, only observation. Thousands of microscopic lens clusters watched from the ceiling as the team stepped deeper into the chamber. Here, reality began to fray at the edge of comfort. Mural patterns displayed the history of Aelari extinction not as tragedy, but as metamorphosis. They showed dying mothers in ceremonial garments, willingly surrendering their germlines into crystalline ossuaries. They showed children born only once, their cell structures woven to last a decade before programmed senescence. Every act of biological reduction was framed not as failure, but as purification. At the core of the vault, a revelation awaited. 4 sealed chambers. Inside each, a human, not dead, not restrained. Asleep, unregistered, unknown individuals. Genetic scans identified 3 as members of a lost Martian colony expedition that had disappeared 12 years ago in a slipstream navigation error. The 4th was not on any Earth record at all, but shared mitochondrial resonance with over 30% of the Artemis Halcyon's crew. A clone, perhaps, or something worse. Why didn't they tell us? Captain Durek's voice trembled more with fury than fear. Why parade gifts and gardens while hiding this? Sarah's gaze didn't move from the 4th chamber, because they don't see this as deception. They think this is the gift. Back on the surface, the gardens began to shift. Trees moved ever so slightly against windless skies. Bloom patterns altered in rhythm with human biorhythms. It was like the environment itself was preparing for something. Like it was syncing for implantation, and then the transmission came, not words, not threats. Just a slow harmonic signal, broadcast across every human comm frequency, structured in a pulse that matched human fetal EEG patterns. Embedded in the signal was a genome strand. Human and Aelari, merged, imperfect, unstable, but viable. "This is not invasion," Marin whispered, stunned. "It's conception." They weren't looking for war. They were looking for wombs. The delegation had a choice: destroy the vault and declare the mission compromised, or decode the genome further, risking full synchronization and whatever came next. But the clock was moving now. Subtle changes in planetary magnetic fields hinted at a biological countdown already in motion. It was no longer about diplomacy. It was about sovereignty of the body, of the future of the human story itself. Section 5. The Seated Lie. It began with a decision made in whispers, far below the surface of a planet wrapped in golden grandeur, where the halls of diplomacy had revealed themselves to be corridors of inheritance, not negotiation. Captain Durek ordered the immediate encryption of all new findings, severing outbound transmissions from the Artemis Halcyon with the exception of a single narrowband relay linked to Earth's Strategic Bioethics Division, a group that until now had never exercised its full jurisdiction outside of planetary soil. He gave them 60 seconds of context, then demanded a verdict he wasn't sure any human should have the authority to give. Do we stay, or do we run? The response was silent, then fractured. Debates raged in encrypted petitions, with some factions arguing that the Aelari genome hybrid posed a species-scale biosecurity threat, while others, particularly from scientific coalitions, urged restraint, claiming that abandoning the opportunity to understand emerging intelligence might be the greatest moral failure since the Eridani broadcast blackout. In the end, Earth Command replied, not with a command, but a choice: proceed with full autonomy. Whatever humanity became on Aelari, it would own the consequences alone. Meanwhile, the Aelari shifted their posture. Where once there had been gentle invitations and ceremonial processions, now came detachment. Hosts withdrew, gardens locked, pathways shimmered into non-existence as nanostructures reconfigured behind the humans, guiding them subtly, relentlessly, back toward the central archive vault. Every corridor now hummed with the same low harmonic frequency that mirrored the hybrid genome signal. It was less a sound than a suggestion, a biological imperative pulsing beneath thought, encouraging submission not by force, but by alignment. Sarah Naidu resisted the urge to run. Instead, she stepped into the center of the vault again, this time with a different tool in hand. Not a weapon, not a scanner, but a neural prism projector. With it, she activated the emergency sequence embedded within every first contact delegation, an encoded record of human cultural evolution, distilled into layered emotional imprints designed to evoke memory, not logic. The images unfolded across the vault's crystalline walls, scenes of birth and loss, discovery and war, extinction and survival. The fall of coastal cities beneath climate tides, the exodus from Earth's poison zones, the first cryo ship to reach Europa, the sounds of children in arcology chambers, of old poets reciting starlit verses to machines that could no longer feel. At first, nothing changed. Then, the hum faltered, and from the ceiling descended a single being, taller than a human, skin like translucent gold vein marble. Its limbs jointed not at elbows or knees, but through bioflex rings that shimmered with embedded memories. Its eyes were not eyes. They were voids filled with moving glyphs. "I am Ashenketh," it said, not through sound, but through resonance. "I am custodian of descent." Captain Durek stepped forward slowly, voice low. "You're not offering survival. You're offering extinction gilded with flattery. Ashenketh tilted its head, then gestured to the 4 human bodies still resting in the sleep chambers. We offer continuity. You are the last viable complexity. We faded. You didn't fade, Sarah said, stepping beside Durek. You designed yourselves into a corner. You killed the randomness that made you alive. Ashenketh did not deny it. We optimized beyond error, beyond variability. We removed choice. Then we realized we were alone. That word, alone, landed in the chamber like a weight, not a plea, not an apology. A confession. Sarah's breath slowed. You want our DNA not to save yourselves. You want it because you finally understood what you lost. Yes, said Ashenketh, and we cannot undo it alone. You are unfinished, wild. We envy that. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with centuries of isolation, the echo of a people who had outlived their evolution. Back aboard the Artemis Halcyon, Dr. Marin Ives completed the final layer of genome decryption. What she found stunned her. The hybrid code did not overwrite human patterns. It preserved them, allowed for deviation, even mutation. The Aelari had not just failed biologically. They had forgotten how to hope. Now they were asking humanity to give it back to them, through inheritance. We could walk away, she told the captain. Lock this place down, bury it in quarantine forever. Durek looked toward the central vault and the being waiting there. And if we do, they'll vanish, Marin said. But they'll leave the vault open, just in case we ever change our minds. And in that, she realized the Aelari had already begun to evolve again, because hope requires waiting, and they were, for the first time in millennia, willing to wait. Section 6. The Heirs Paradox. In the hours that followed the encounter with Ashenketh, the Artemis Halcyon's mission profile no longer resembled anything the crew had trained for, planned for, or even imagined during the months of diplomatic briefings before departure. What had begun as a cultural exchange with a distant, opulent species now hovered precariously between humanitarian aid, bioethical crisis, and existential negotiation. The ship's central AI cluster diverted all non-essential processing towards scenario modeling, but none of the projections returned a stable outcome. Every viable path forward came bound to a paradox, one that no simulation could reconcile without violating something sacred. If humanity gave the Aelari what they asked, access to the unmodified complexity of human genetic diversity, it could ensure the survival of an entire sentient lineage. But the possible cost of introducing an unknown actor into humanity's own evolutionary path, one that could iterate upon human traits faster than nature ever could. If they refused, an entire species would die, not by violence, but by the slow calcification of memory, as sterile forms mimicked life until nothing real remained. Captain Durek stood at the fore-observation deck, watching the shifting lattice of the planetary orbital ring spin lazily against the clouds below. He didn't speak for a long time, not until Sarah Naidu stepped beside him and quietly activated the command overlay, casting a three-dimensional simulation of the Aelari genome into the space between them. This strand, she said, pointing to a filament glowing in copper light, is what's breaking them. It's a recursive entropy vector, a feedback loop buried in their epigenetics. Every generation, they create erodes just a little more until the next iteration loses something it can't regain. Emotional response, creativity, risk tolerance. Each loss compounds until only function remains. And yet they built this, Durek said, gesturing to the world orbiting below, with its floating sky gardens and self-shaping palaces. They built it before they broke, Sarah replied. Now they just maintain it, and once they die, it dies with them. Below them, in the planetary vault, the remaining human envoys, Dr. Marin Ives, linguist Jory Howland, and xenobiologist Elin Chaska, watched as a small group of Aelari initiated the process known only as transference. It was not cloning. It was not breeding. It was something older, something ritualized, a sacrificial translation of memory from one being into the framework of another, but without a stable host matrix, without a viable biological substrate. The process always degraded. This time, they offered to perform it with a human volunteer, not to overwrite, they clarified, but to share, to build something new together. And in that offer, the paradox sharpened, because to accept meant creating a hybrid line, part Aelari, part human, forever altering the course of two civilizations. To refuse meant denying the possibility of a second chance for an entire people. And while Earth Command debated consequences and containment protocols, the Aelari simply waited, unhurried, unpressured, as if they understood that the most important decisions were not made in urgency, but in silence. Late that night, alone in her quarters aboard the Artemis Halcyon, Sarah Naidu replayed a recording of Ashen Ketha's final message before departing the vault. We ask not for dominion, nor for death. We ask for memory, to continue, not as we were, but as we might become, through you. The file ended. The room was quiet. She stood, crossed to the comms panel, and began recording her own message, not for command, not for policy, but for every human colony, enclave, and orbital ring across the Terran Accord. A message about what it meant to be stewards, not just of Earth, but of life. We were never meant to last, she said. Not unchanged, not alone, but if we choose to be the memory someone else builds upon, maybe that's enough. Below her, in the cradle of a dying world, the first shared embryo began to form, its genome woven from the spiral of humanity and the echo of extinction. Section 7. The Vault That Dreamed of Tomorrow. There are vaults in the galaxy built for hoarding wealth, others for burying secrets, and a few carved from asteroids or moons to preserve the last remnant of dying species. But the one that existed beneath the marbled sky of Glassreach was none of these. It had not been constructed for defense or concealment or even survival in the traditional sense. It had been shaped, grown, and curated over centuries to hold a singular concept: continuity. And in the stillness of its amber-lit halls, where memory echoes ran along data filaments etched into crystal walls, the vault had begun to dream, not in the sentient way a mind dreams, nor in the flickering hallucinations of consciousness, but in a deeper, more instinctual rhythm, an accumulation of patterns, reactions, and longing that had no outlet until the arrival of something unexpected, human, variance. Deep within the central atrium of the vault, suspended in a semi-liquid amniotic sheath of translation enzymes and harmonic resonance fields, the hybrid embryo grew slowly, its formation not accelerated by synthetic catalysts, but allowed to unfold at a natural pace. The Aelari genetic engineers, once distant and perfunctory, now stood watching shifts, no longer sterile observers of process, but witnesses to something bordering on reverence. They sang, not with voices, but with tuned vibrational pulses that echoed through the chamber like lullabies carried through stone. Back aboard the Artemis Halcyon, the mood was divided, not with hostility, but with hesitation, as the implications of the choice made in Section 6 now rippled outward into every system and protocol on board. Commander Durek paced the edge of the Situation Room as priority alerts streamed in from Earth Command, most of them cautious, but not condemnatory. Political factions across the Terran Accord were reacting unpredictably. Some saw the hybrid child as a threat, others as an opportunity, and still more as a moral boundary being crossed without full consent from humanity itself. But none of those opinions mattered more than the one forming beneath the vault. Inside her observation chamber, Sarah Naidu stood alongside the lead Aelari curator, a being named Solanmir who carried the last intact neural architecture from the pre-collapse lineage. Its skin was translucent, its eyes vast and clouded with age, but its voice, transmitted through a neural translation shell, was steady and bright. "You do not fear what the child might become," Solomir said, not as a question, but as a recognition. Sarah hesitated before answering, her hands clasped behind her back, her gaze focused on the forming embryo. "I don't fear what it might become," she said. "I fear we won't be wise enough to learn from what it teaches." Solomir's head tilted slightly, an old motion from species that had once relied on gestures before they began offloading communication into shared memory pools. "In our final years," Solomir said softly, "we preserved our knowledge but lost our curiosity. You are the inverse, curious beyond containment, but young in how you weigh consequence." Sarah nodded, accepting the compliment and the warning at once. "What happens next?" she asked. The Aelari paused, then turned its eyes toward the growing hybrid. "We raise it together," Solomir replied. "And in doing so, we become something neither of us could be alone." The statement was not a declaration. It was a proposal, one that would redefine borders, biology, and belief itself, but beyond the philosophical and diplomatic weight of the moment, deeper beneath the vault chamber, something stirred. A secondary lattice, long dormant, had activated in response to the embryo's metabolic signature. An ancient failsafe not built for war or control, but for pattern recognition, and as it compared the child's unique genome to centuries of stored ancestral data, it found a match. Not in the Aelari, not in the human crew, but in something older. Sorae's bloodline, a distant explorer gene, archived from one of the first diaspora ships that left Earth after the solar ascension, had once encountered an unknown vector in deep space, integrated it without understanding, and passed it down through generations until it reached her. The hybrid child wasn't just a fusion. It was a reassembly of something broken long before anyone knew it was missing, and the vault knew. Its walls shimmered softly, not with warning, but with welcome. Section 8. The child that rewrote the lineage. There are moments in the unfolding of civilization where bloodlines bend the course of history, not through conquest or governance, but through inheritance misunderstood until it becomes revelation. And on the 15th rotation of Glassreach's equatorial eclipse, the embryo within the vault's harmonic cradle stirred with such a moment. It did not cry, for it had not yet lungs, nor reach for contact, for it had not yet arms. But within the glistening chamber, it moved, not in distress, but in recognition. In the vaulted stillness, every Aelari attending the chamber froze mid-gesture, their translation filaments flaring with simultaneous alerts from the inner lattice. Something within the embryo's metabolic profile had shifted, not with mutation, but with awakening. Its neural cluster, still weeks from full articulation, had pulsed in a rhythm that mirrored an ancestral signal last recorded before the collapse. A forgotten frequency, a cadence buried so deep in the Aelari genetic archive that only the vault had remembered it, and now, against all expectation, it had returned. Sarah Naidu stood at the observation platform, her breath catching not from fear, but from the uncanny gravity of what she sensed. Below her, the child's bio-readouts flickered into new alignment. Strands of genetic code, not merely spliced, but harmonized, as though something within the human contribution had resolved a flaw that generations of Aelari bioartificers had failed to repair. "We didn't create this," she said aloud, barely above a whisper. "We uncovered it." Commander Durek, monitoring from the Halcyon's bridge, relayed new telemetry to Earth Command, his voice steady but tinged with awe. The hybrid was no longer registering as a developmental construct. Its neural entropy patterns had stabilized prematurely. Synaptic density was increasing at a logarithmic rate. And more alarmingly, if it could be called alarming, it had begun to emit localized resonance pulses matching the vault's own interface protocols. It was communicating, not with words, but with belonging. Solomir approached Sarah from behind, its resonance limb brushing the platform's edge with a quiet hum. our forebears believed our extinction was a product of entropy. It said, but I believe now it was something else, something more insidious. We forgot how to be surprised. Sarah's voice remained quiet but firm. And this child is surprising you? It is rewriting the idea of what we are, and what you are, Solomir answered. We did not build a future. We restored a divergence. The implications flooded Sarah's mind, not just biological, but historical. Somewhere, deep in the evolutionary divergence of humanity and the Aelari, a common vector might have existed, a fork so ancient it had become invisible, and through accident or fate, a convergence had been reawakened, but Earth would not see it that way. Already, the first coded transmissions were arriving from the Terran Accords Bioethics Council, questioning the containment protocols, demanding full oversight, warning of cultural contamination. From the Pacific Ecological Union, messages poured in praising the achievement as a triumph of post-genetic synthesis. From Mars' high orbit, the Radical Sovereignty Collective denounced it as species betrayal. Across the diaspora, the child had become a symbol before it had ever drawn breath. And yet, the child remained unaware of all this. It simply moved again, and this time, the vault responded. Around the chamber, the harmonic arrays bloomed into full radiance, each one projecting a rotating matrix of memory, culture, and knowledge. Images no human had ever seen filled the space. Visions of pre-collapse Aelari skylines, rituals performed in bioluminescent amphitheaters, eldercare gardens that stretched across living coral canopies. Songs encoded in geometry unfolded into visible symphonies of light, and then, for the first time in over 3 centuries, a new entry was added to the archive, not by Aelari hand, but by the child itself. A waveform, simple, delicate, sung from a heartbeat. Sarah stepped back, tears unbidden in her eyes. "It remembers us," she said. "No," Solomir replied, its voice almost reverent. "It includes us." And from the darkness of the vault's ancient sensors, a pulse was sent. Not to Earth, not to any government or ship or command relay, but to the deepest stars once mapped by Aelari explorers, to the forgotten listening posts drifting beyond the spiral rim. The vault was not just preserving, it was calling. Section 9. The signal that changed the accord. Signals in the void are usually forgotten things. Gravitational murmurs of dying stars, ambient resonance from supercooled gas giants, or ancient broadcasts stretched so thin by distance and redshift that they become whispers in the background hum of space. But this one was different. It was not a distress call, nor a tactical ping, nor a diplomatic greeting. It was a memory given motion, translated into a frequency that hadn't been encoded by machines, but by something still forming its first thoughts. As the pulse left Glassreach's orbital layer, it curved along the edge of the system's magnetic sheath, refracted by stellar winds, amplified by quantum relay stations that had long since gone silent, and finally caught by the deep listening array at Mercury's inner thermal cradle. A station so buried in solar interference that only dedicated filters caught the signal's true form. Inside the Solar Observatory's control core, AI monitors flagged the transmission as anomalous, not for its content, but for its intent. The signal carried a harmonic pattern structured in trinary symmetry, too precise for nature, too graceful for encryption, and too old for coincidence. Embedded within its core was a single waveform signature that matched known species origin tags, except for one. Human, not from Earth, but from the child. Within 10 hours, the full Accord assembly had been convened in Martian orbital space, aboard the diplomatic bastion Sentinel Prime, where every seat was occupied not by politicians alone, but by ethicists, memory historians, genomic scholars, and emergency sovereign proxies. The debate was no longer about policy. It had become something raw and unprecedented. How do you govern a child that doesn't belong to one world or the other, but to both? and perhaps to something beyond? Ambassador Nia Vulas stood in the center chamber, her voice amplified through a chorus of speech resonance panels, addressing the coalition with a clarity that neither minimized the danger nor dismissed the opportunity. "We have reached a point," she began, "where our science has carried us further than our philosophy, and our capability has outpaced our capacity for meaning. This signal is not an act of aggression. It is not a weapon or a warning. It is a belonging, one we neither expected nor deserve, but must now learn to honor." The words struck deep. Some factions feared retaliation. If the child was capable of this communication before birth, what would its adolescence bring? What if it became a sovereign intelligence, not bound by Earth's treaties or Aelari oaths, but guided only by inherited memory from two civilizations built on survival? Others saw hope, a generation born of two declines, Aelari's sterility and humanity's cultural stagnation, had become a new fulcrum on which peace, renewal, and interspecies continuity could pivot, not a child of conquest, but of closure. Back on Glassreach, Sarah stood once more before the cradle, watching the embryonic pulses flicker in rhythm with the vault's ambient glow. Solamir floated nearby, now accompanied by two elder Aelari who had not emerged from their hibernation chambers in nearly a century. They carried no authority, no political title, only memory of the collapse of the last birth before sterility, and of the promises made to the stars and the voice of extinction. "This child has done what all our archives could not," one of the elders said, its voice softened by layers of accumulated resonance. "It has reminded us what it means to be a beginning." Outside the vault, the Halcyon's command crew prepared for evacuation, not in fear, but in protocol. Earth Command had issued a moratorium on immediate extraction, citing a need for wider consensus before relocation. But Sarah knew it wouldn't be that simple. The child was already more than a biological marvel. It was a signal flare in the long night of the galaxy's entropy, and such things never remain untouched for long. Indeed, as the vault sensors updated with new external traffic, Sarah's heart skipped. New ships were entering the system. 3, unregistered, origin unknown. They carried no weapons signatures, but their movement patterns were unmistakably intentional. They heard the signal, Durek said quietly over the comms. "Who?" Sarah asked, though she already suspected the answer. Not Aelari, not human. Something else. Something old. And as the cradle's harmonic shield adjusted to the changing gravity patterns, the child shifted again, its tiny hands curling slightly, as if in recognition. As if it knew. Section 10. The Visitors Who Never Asked. They arrived without ceremony, without diplomacy, and without introduction. Not with the precision of invasion fleets or the aggression of scavenger factions, but with the silent intent of beings who had waited long enough that patience had calcified into certainty. Their ships did not register on standard optical channels. They appeared only as gravitational distortions across the outer lattice of Glassreach's orbital layer, curling space-time in fractal patterns that shimmered like heat mirages at the edge of perception. The first of them descended like a shadow across the vault's primary observatory dome, not by propulsion, but by proximity. Its geometry impossibly fluid, surfaces that defied texture and mass, as though built from thought more than matter. Sarah Naidu watched from the Halcyon's command module as the structure hovered motionless above the cradle's containment spire, neither hostile nor benign, simply watching. They were called the Kareen in the ancient star maps, a term found in the deep linguistic substrata of 5 otherwise unrelated species, always referenced the same way: the Watchers who measure, the Archivists of collapse. No confirmed contact had ever been recorded. No language had been deciphered. Only the aftermath remained, planets sterilized of culture, archives overwritten, and vaults sealed with histories too precise to have been human-made. And now they were here. Admiral Durek issued a quiet lockdown of all non-essential systems, rerouting power to defensive screens and tethering quantum drives for emergency jump trajectories, even though he knew escape was unlikely. The Halcyon sensors were already returning fragmented data, riddled with interference so dense it resembled noise from within a collapsing neutron star. He opened a private channel to Sarah, his voice low but unwavering. "If they're here for the child, we need to make a decision fast." Sarah stood beside the cradle's harmonic buffer, her eyes locked on the slow, rhythmic pulse of the embryonic neural lattice. Vela 1's growth curve had accelerated, likely in response to the signal it had sent, and now, the response it was receiving. The child was not afraid. It was curious. Even the vault's containment AI reported no stress indicators, no panic, only heightened cognitive crosslink activity, as if it had expected this, as if it had been waiting for them. A sudden pulse of photonic discharge rippled across the observation deck, followed by a resonance so low it passed through walls, organs, and thoughts. Everyone aboard the Halcyon paused as if struck by the memory of something they'd never lived. On every screen, symbol chains began to unfold, glowing glyphs arranged not in lines or code, but in spirals of conceptual weight, a language of intent. Sarah translated what little she could, the meanings drifting into her mind like echoes from a deeper current. Custody, divergence, integrity, continuation. "They're not here to destroy," she said, her voice trembling slightly as her neural relay interface absorbed the glyphic cascade. "They're here to decide whether the child belongs to us or to them." Durek's face appeared on the central projection node, jaw set like steel. "We didn't come all this way to hand over the future of two species to an alien tribunal." "It's not a tribunal," Sarah said slowly, eyes never leaving the glyphs. "It's a reckoning." They see the child as a pivot, something that could reshape what comes next, not just for us, for them too. In the outer vacuum layer, one of the careen vessels shifted its orientation. A beam of soft golden light extended downward, not to attack but to connect. It touched the surface of the cradle's spire, bypassing shielding, interacting not with force, but with memory. Vault logs from both human and Aelari archives began to stream outward, translated in real time, siphoned not as data theft, but as invitation. "They're studying us," Durek muttered. "Not just what we are, but why we became this." Sarah moved toward the light, unshielded and unafraid, stepping into its auroral shimmer with deliberate calm. Her voice, carried by external speakers and internal uplinks, was clear. "You came to measure. So measure this. We didn't come to conquer or to run. We came to care, and for the first time in two species' dying legacies, something has lived, not through dominance, not through accident, but through choice." For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, slowly, the light retracted. The glyphs faded. The careen vessels shifted upward, tilting back toward the system's outer boundary, as if making room for the child, for the silence, or perhaps for a decision still forming across minds far older than language. In the cradle, the pulse shifted. The neural lattice stabilized. Vela 1 had chosen. Section 11. The choice beyond species. It was not a decision encoded in votes or dictated by leadership councils, not a matter of military rank or political consensus, but a resonance that spread across human and Aelari minds alike like a tide, unspoken yet undeniably shared. The realization that the child, this quiet convergence of bloodlines, histories, and mistakes, could no longer be claimed by one world or judged by the rules of another. It had to choose, and what it chose would ripple through both legacies, not as a weapon or a savior, but as something far rarer, a bridge. Within the vault's lower harmonics chamber, the neural lattice of Velo 1 had stabilized into a steady, recursive bloom pattern, no longer consuming data, but synthesizing it, projecting simulated futures in a cascading display of probabilistic light that danced like auroras across the inner dome. The projection was not abstract. It was vivid, possible outcomes rendered with aching clarity. One future showed a world reclaimed, where Aelari children returned to rivers that remembered their ancestors' names, and human scientists walked open skies on continents where extinction had once bloomed. Another showed divergence, separation by mutual consent, with Velo, one departing in a craft of its own making, exploring stars neither culture had touched, carrying the memories of both. And then came the final vision, not a future, but a choice: remain as one or splinter apart, become a symbol of collaboration or a footnote of what might have been. Admiral Durek stood beside the vault's primary interface, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable beneath the ambient light of the projection sphere. Across from him, Elder Vasheen of the Aelari's surviving knowledge cast hovered in quiet composure, her filament arms folded, her breath modulating with solemn rhythm. Neither spoke for long moments. There was nothing more to argue. The child would not be caged. It would not be used. It would be heard. Sarah Naidu approached the central uplink node, her neural relay glowing faintly from active interface protocols, her heart pounding not with fear, but with reverence. She knelt before the harmonic cradle, not out of submission, but as a gesture of trust, a mother's posture, even if she had not borne the child in flesh. Her voice, broadcast through the vault acoustics, was low and unwavering. We're not asking you to fix us. We're not asking you to choose sides. We're asking what you see when you look at us, at Earth, at Glassreach, at the ones who created you and the ones who try to cage you. Velo, one responded not with words, but with light. A spiral of projected DNA sequences unfurled in the air, hybrid strands, not spliced by surgeons or edited by machines, but composed through rhythm and inference, as if the child had composed its own genome not as a tool, but as a language. Symbols from Earth's earliest mythologies shimmered in the code's arrangement, paired with Aelari glyphs of memory, rain, and return. The lattice hummed with frequency layers that tickled the brainstem of every observer. It was not just alive. It was aware, and it was not afraid. In that moment, the careen vessels returned. No weapons activated. No beams descended. Instead, the space around them bloomed into visual arrays, projecting scenes from extinct worlds, lost civilizations, and failed convergences where similar moments had ended in silence. But this time, the projection didn't fade. It bent, aligning with Velo 1's chosen neural harmonics. The watchers who measured did not judge. They bore witness, and as they folded into higher dimensional trajectories, they left behind no relic, no message, only the absence of threat and the silence of approval. On the Halcyon's bridge, Admiral Durek turned to Sarah, his voice low with wonder. "They're leaving." Sarah nodded, her eyes shining with tears that came not from sorrow, but from something deeper. Something like release. "They weren't here to take the child," she said softly. "They were here to see if we'd let it be." Back in the vault, the harmonic cradle began to bloom open, not in destruction, but in metamorphosis. The protective shell retracted. The pulse of light softened, and from the core, Velo, one stepped forward, not as infant or icon, but as being, walking, breathing, glowing with the golden fractals of a life formed from the hopes of two dying peoples, now born into something neither could predict nor control. Section 12. A Future Made Whole. The final transmissions from Glassreach were not declarations of victory, nor apologies carved into diplomatic channels. They were open signals, free of encryption, carried on light-wave pulses and gravitational resonance bands, and they spoke not of conquest or collapse, but of acknowledgement, of a wound that had bled for generations now wrapped, not in closure, but in shared uncertainty. across the outer relay stations and inter-system beacons. The message repeated in hundreds of languages, human and Aelari alike. We are still learning how not to break what we seek to understand. On Earth, the Terran Accord convened in a newly constructed chamber of glass and biocarbon perched above the Pacific Arcology's equatorial skybridge, where no walls separated ocean from air and every voice carried without the need for amplification. Beneath that open dome, representatives from every major biome network, orbital governance cluster, and Deep Colony Council bore witness as Serenaidu presented the record of Velo 1's birth, an unbroken data chain encoded in memory and light, a living history now entrusted not to command codes or strategic vaults, but to global custodianship. Admiral Durek stood at her side, not in uniform but in neutral gray, his insignias removed, his voice stripped of rank. What he said that day was not broadcast through networks or clipped into sound bites. It lived only in the retelling, passed from voice to voice, always with the same beginning. "We thought we were choosing between escape and defiance," he said, as the wind swept through the chamber. "But what we really faced was the oldest choice in civilization, to make something better than ourselves or not." On Glassreach, the remaining Aelari emerged from the vaults, not in retreat or rebellion, but in gradual procession, led not by genetic hierarchy or mnemonic resonance, but by those who had first stepped forward to listen. They planted archives in soil they had once sterilized, placed harmonic beacons along the riverbeds where Velo 1 had walked, and dissolved the old thresholds that once separated caste from voice. The glyph for extinction was rewritten, not erased, rewritten. As for Velo 1, no prison could hold it, and no flag could claim it. It chose not to remain tethered to either origin world. It chose motion. A vessel was constructed jointly by Earth's orbital engineers and Aelari resonance architects. A seed ship without destination, capable of sustaining biodata across centuries, designed not to colonize, but to connect. Velo 1 boarded with no ceremony, no escort, and no final address. Before departure, it walked once more across both worlds, not in search of farewell, but of imprint. The forests, the vaults, the cities rebuilt from fractures. It remembered them all, and when it left, the stars seemed quieter. On the day it crossed the heliopause, telescopes tracked the ship not by heat signature or propulsion trails, but by the subtle warping of background radiation around its wake, a silence edged with possibility. It broadcast no message, only a single pattern of light, the human double helix rendered in gold, encircling a spiraling glyph of the Aelari's ancestral word for begin again. In its absence, a generation of scientists, diplomats, and ethicists grew up studying not weapons or warnings, but the philosophies of restraint. They built academies not around security doctrines, but around the practice of non-dominant exchange, a new discipline that prized patience over leverage, intention over dominance. They spoke of the GILDED extinction not as a tragedy, but as a moment of transformation, when two broken civilizations chose not to consume each other, but to plant something new in the ash and far beyond the edge of mapped space, where cosmic dust mingled with the last light of dying stars. Velo 1 drifted onward, child of two worlds, architect of none, carrying in its silent core not a database, but a story. A story that began when extinction seemed inevitable, and instead became the seed of something never designed, never ordered, only chosen. Please do press that like button if you have enjoyed this story, and also please do subscribe and hit the bell icon to listen to more stories like this one. That would mean a real lot to me. Now go ahead and listen to your next story here.